Our first guest tonight is a familiar voice to many Torontonians. In fact, his dulcet tones are the first things some 400,000 of us hear every morning when we wake up and turn on our morning radio fix of news and views about what's happening in the GTA.
Matt Galloway is one of Canada's most likable and listenable radio personalities on the airwaves. He's the host of CBC's Metro Morning, the top-rated radio program in Toronto, and the person who succeeded longtime host Andy Barry in this role in March of 2010. A skilled interviewer and thoughtful commentator on a range of issues, Matt is also heard nationally as a host of Canada Live and Podcast Playlist, and as an occasional host of The Current and Q. Matt, welcome.
Thank you.
There must be so many people in our audience, as we're saying ourselves. It's so nice to see that face that belongs to the voice we listen to so often. Are people generally surprised when they meet you? Do they think you look like you sound, or do you get any kind of reaction?
No, it's interesting because now in the era of social media, people do have a sense as to what you look like, but you can still remain relatively anonymous until you are out in public in the grocery store and your kids will ask for some sort of ridiculous cereal and you'll say no, and then the person next to you will say, I recognize you. And yeah, people will often say that you sound taller, you sound older, you sound like you have a beard, which I don't know entirely what that means, but that's something that people have said to me before. Radio is, it's like the theater of the imagination. You can kind of imagine in your head what somebody looks like and what somebody how they carry themselves. And then when you run into them, it can either be a disappointment or it can be an entirely different image.
So it works both ways.
Hopefully it's not a disappointment. I can walk around with a bag on my head or something, maybe that would be easier, but no, it's...
Well, you call more attention to yourself that way.
I think so.
You are a pure Ontarian. You were born in Newmarket and raised nearby in Kimberley, Ontario. Mm-hmm. When and what brought you to the big city, and did you take to city life, or was Toronto close enough to you that it was pretty standard and pretty normal move for you to make?
When I was growing up, we were about 2 hours north of the city, and so we spent a lot of time as teenagers thinking about how we could get to Toronto as often as possible, and I would come and I would see bands, and I would buy records, and I would go to movies, and then we'd go back home to what we still call the middle of nowhere. I moved here officially when I was going to university. I went to York University and came in here when I was about 18 years old, and I love Toronto. I mean, I love life in the big city. There are still a lot of things about the city that I don't entirely understand in terms of how people interact and why people don't give each other perhaps the space or the respect that they deserve. That's part of the small town person in me, I think. But I love Toronto, and I like the things that I always liked about this city, the overwhelming sense of possibility, the things that you can discover in this city. And I feel like being relatively new to Toronto, not growing up here, I don't treat some of the gems of the city as a jaded Torontonian might.
You don't take them for granted.
No, I'm always filled with this sense of possibility and discovery. I'll get on the Shepherd East bus and take the bus for 3 hours and stop at strip malls because I'm fascinated with what happens in those strip malls.
Wow.
Whereas people who live here might just drive by them because they're trying to get somewhere else and don't know that some of the best food in the city and some of the most interesting people are there in those places that you pass by. The ravines, to me, are one of those places as well that I spend so much time in because I love the idea of disappearing from the city while you're still in the city. Again, it's this sense that we live in this big sprawling place, and there are so many things about the city that we don't know about, and so many people and the stories that we've never heard before. If you're not from here, you can kind of go and explore them in a different way.
And the history of Toronto is pretty interesting as well, of course, and there's tons of it out there. I want to go back, though, to York University. Mm-hmm. You became the music director at the university's radio station, which was CHRY.
Yes.
Was that your first taste of radio, and did that sort of turn the light bulb on and make you think, I want to do this for the rest of my life?
The amazing luck that I had was that I lived in the residence where the radio station was, and the deal was that if you, during the fundraising drive, gave money, you could be on the radio. And so we went in the first day that I moved into residence with a bunch of friends, and we gave a pittance, a tiny little bit of money, but they put us on the radio and they let us stay. And we stayed for hours and hours and hours. And it was that moment, as you say, that kind of twigged something because I, as a kid, played radio in the bedroom and thought about radio. I listened to radio. We had 2 radio stations that we could get growing up. It was in the Beaver Valley where I lived. And so you could get CBC Radio 2 and CBC Radio 1. And then if you went to the top of the hill, you could get, the rock stations from Toronto.
CKVR.
So it was amazing to have the opportunity not just to listen to radio, but to be part of it. Right. And that, to me, changed my life. I mean, it was that little moment, and a radio station that had 50 watts of power. I mean, it's like a postage stamp is bigger than its footprint, but the number of people that I've met, including my wife, who listened to the radio program and called in with great requests, friends that I've met that have been best friends for years because we worked in the station together or we came together through music, it did change my life, and it gave me the possibility of a career in radio as well.
So when you had that first job, it was not Metro Morning, it was actually, you started with Here and Now?
Yeah, this was a time, and I was doing some work in Montreal for CBC as well, and then kind of kicked at the door long enough that they eventually let me in to do a little bit of freelance work in Toronto. But the first real hosting job I had was Here and Now.
So that was an afternoon program. So why did you trade in the comfort of an afternoon program for the bone-tiring early morning show? I mean, it really is. It must be sleep-depriving to have moved from that to Metro Morning, where you have to get up at a very early hour.
I get up at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Whoa.
And I wouldn't say that I would naturally get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, but I'm an early morning person. And I love
early?
Well, I love being up early. I love seeing cities wake up. When I travel, one of the things I do is I get up very early and I go running to see the city wake up, and you see the city start to engage wherever you happen to be. But there's also, Jim said this, I mean, I'm the first voice that people hear.
Yeah.
There's something really special about that. That if you are the first thing that somebody hears when they wake up, you can set their day on a certain course, you can ruin their day, you can tell them about something that happened while they're sleeping overnight. That to me is I mean, it's a privilege and an honor, but it's something really special in broadcasting as well, particularly when we live in a time now where you can find out anything at any time. When you're sleeping, you're not getting that information. We're the first thing that people hear.
So it was a more attractive proposition for relating to your audience.
Yeah, and also just, I mean, my hours. I like having the rest of my day to do things. And so I go to bed at a early time, and I make sure that I get enough sleep. I exercise and stay healthy.
What's your morning wake-up routine?
I wake up at 3 before my alarm goes off.
Before?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the secret of a good marriage, I think, is to make sure that your partner isn't woken up by your early morning alarm.
And does it take more than one alarm to get you up?
No, I'm out the door and done. The alarm in the last several weeks hasn't gone off because there are a number of alarms just in case, but I make sure the alarm doesn't go off.
That's terrific.
I spend a lot of time reading everything that's out there, from newspapers from around the world and here in Toronto to Twitter and Facebook and things like that. Ride my bike into work, go through all of our scripts, and we're on the air at 5:30. So I do a lot of work before we hit the air.
Right.
You took over the mantle, and it became a mantle by the time you took it over, of being the host of Metro Morning, because you succeeded Andy Barry, who had become an icon.
Yeah.
He had hosted the show for 15 years, Joe Cote for a number of years before that. How difficult was that to fill the shoes of somebody who had become truly a revered celebrity?
I made it very clear that I wasn't going to fill anybody's shoes. Andy is Andy, and Andy's a legend. He'd been doing this job, broadcasting, for longer than I'd been alive. And I grew up listening to him, and I grew up using him as a mentor and as a sounding board for the work that I was doing. But I'm not him. And he was very clear to people that I couldn't be him. We're very different people. We have very different backgrounds. We might have similar interests, but different experiences. And so there was no way that I could be who he is. And I don't think our audience would expect that from me. People often say you sound, if I run into people in the grocery store or out on the streets, you sound exactly like you do on the radio. And that's the point, is that I am who I am, and I bring myself to the airwaves. So yes, it's a challenge because he is somebody who is an icon, and people would say, I mean, either they miss him or they wish that he was there to do a certain interview. There's not much you can do. You kind of try and win people over one listener at a time. And I've been fortunate because people gave me a lot of space, and I feel like I've grown into a job that I love.
You know, the show is well known for having very, very interesting, sometimes controversial people on it. In your 5.5 years, who are some of the most interesting guests you've had? And I'll ask you also just to comment on your recent interview with our new Prime Minister.
Well, the Prime Minister is one of them. I mean, that was fascinating. I flew
And you
to
went to
Ottawa.
Ottawa for that.
Yeah, and it was just an email that I'd sent. We'd been doing a series on Syrian refugees, and sent an email to somebody in his office saying, could we wrap this up with an interview with the Prime Minister? And they said yes. And so off we went in following days to interview him, and that's a fascinating story in a number of reasons. And I've said this on air, it's not about politics and partisan politics, but there's a generational shift that has happened. He's my age. The people who are around him are my age. We, 45, 43-year-olds are in charge now, which is fascinating and incredible to see. So we had a great conversation, not just about the big issues of the day, but also about what it's like to be a young father, surrounded by life and surrounded by all the pressures of the job. He was very interesting. I mean, we have a number of politicians, we have actors, we have authors. Some of the best interviews, though, are with people that would say to you, I don't have a story to tell. There's nothing that I have. And it turns out they have an extraordinary story to tell. Whether they've done something incredible, they've traveled somewhere and met somebody, they find themselves as a normal person in extraordinary circumstances by being a hero and pulling somebody off a building, or through tragedy, becoming a spokesperson for something like mental illness and the stigma around suicide. Those are often the interviews that hit people the hardest, and they're the ones that I remember the most. The ones that, again, a normal person, and you try and put yourself in their shoes, who's suddenly in extraordinary circumstances. Would I be able to be as composed as they are in that situation? I don't think so. And yet, when you get to talk to them, you realize that they're just somebody who's trying to make it happen and trying to kind of pull it together.
Yeah, and you've had some extraordinary people who aren't known names, but they have great stories, as you've said. But it's really hard. I mean, we are always saying how difficult it is within the 16 minutes we have to interview somebody on this show, how hard it is to actually get everything out that you want to talk about. How do you find it with half that time, or less in some cases? You've got 8 minutes or less. Yeah. Is it a challenge to be able to bring life to that story and to give that person the time they need? It is,
but you know this, the most important part of this job is not asking the questions, it's listening and figuring out what the next part of the conversation should be. And so you have a set of questions that you might want to ask, you have an idea as to where you want to go, but you also have to play it like an accordion and figure out what is interesting and what can be excised to move on to a more interesting part. And so we try and get a lot into not just 5 minutes, but a 3-hour radio program. We're doing about 10, 12, 13 interviews a day, and it moves very quickly. I always say it's like being strapped to a bullet train. But in that time, I think we get a lot out, and we can always have people back if it's necessary, or like with the Prime Minister, we can do longer interviews. But I think in the morning, I mean, we also have to think of what people are doing. In the morning when you're listening to the radio, you're not just sitting with a cup of tea kind of waiting for the next words to fall out of my mouth. You're running around and you're probably getting ready to go to work, you're showering, shaving.
Listening.
People come in and out, and so you have to think of what it is that they're doing, and you have to try and steal their attention.
Matt, how much of a challenge is it for you to do your show and be upbeat and be positive and totally on top of what you're doing when all around you at the CBC and throughout the media generally, things seem to be crumbling? The pillar of the media in Canada is crumbling before our eyes. And at CBC, you're dealing with people who've been laid off, you're dealing with budget cuts and so on. How do you stay up in all of that?
I think radio, and that's true, all of those things are happening not just at CBC but elsewhere. But I think radio is special, and you would expect me to say that as the radio guy, but I think it is special. There is something incredible about the intimate connection that radio has. It's like, I talk this far away from a microphone, it's 3 or 4 inches away. If I were to come up and do that to you, it'd be like whispering in your ear.
It's intimate.
It's so intimate, and it's so powerful in that way that I think even in an era where I'm the person, I have phones and tablets and information kind of plowing at me all the time, a fire hose of information, radio is able to kind of cut through that noise and give people an intimate conversation. And so we'll hear from people who say, I'm late for work because of this. I missed my train because of this. There's a great story of a guy who was making a cup of tea, and he was walking across his kitchen with a tea kettle in the middle of an interview, and he stopped because of what we were saying. And suddenly his hand got hot, he dropped the kettle. The kettle smashes on the ground. But that happened because he got caught up in what it was that we were saying, what was happening.
Right.
That's the best compliment you can get. And so, yes, there's carnage in the media world, and it's not pretty. At the same time, if you can find something that works and still has an intimate connection with people, we have more listeners now to our program than we've ever had.
That's great.
Despite the fact that people can listen to anything that they want. And we're not giving away trips to Mexico, we're not going to fly you to Cuba. We're having pretty serious conversations about what's happening in the city. and more people want to listen now than ever before.
So you're holding their interest.
Well, that to me is proof that there is a need for smart conversation, but also that radio can reel people in a way that perhaps other mediums can't.
Yeah, and a tribute to you that you can do that.
Well, no, it's to my team. I mean, it's me that happens to host it, but we have an extraordinary group of people that work to make me sound smart.
Okay, so we don't have a lot of time left. We have to ask you, because you've lived in the West End about 20 years or so with your wife and your 2 daughters. You go to restaurants all over the city. You cycle, you run now. What are some of your favorite spots in Toronto?
Cedar Vale Ravine, to me, is just, I run every single day.
Sort of Bathurst and St. Clair.
He didn't miss a beat. He knows exactly. Okay.
No, but that's one of those places that, again, I can just disappear in the city. I can come out and I can see the CN Tower, I can disappear and I can see deer and foxes. That to me is one of those wonderful places. Kensington Market, we just talked about a new adult coloring book about Kensington Market.
Yeah.
And it's one of those places, again, that people come from around the world and they see the heart of the city there. But I mean, I'm serious. If you take a bus and you go along, Shepherd, Eglinton, and you see all those strip malls, that's where the city lives. That's where the diversity that we talk about in the city can be really felt. And so you get off and you go into an Afghan restaurant. You go and get your hair cut at this barber shop. You meet people who are waiting in line at a convenience store. That, to me, is where the city really lives. And that's where the stories in the city are. And I love going to those places. It's not for research. It's because that's that sense of adventure that I love about the city.
Yeah.
Very quickly, last question. Would you ever want to do what you do anywhere else? Because you clearly love Toronto.
I think there's something special about not just the CBC, but also about the city. And I love being able to talk about my town and where I am right now.
Well, you do an excellent job of it.
Thank you for reintroducing us to Toronto every morning,
Yes, it's
Matt.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Coming up after the break, music executive and philanthropist Gary Slate.